Okay, so think about this, right? We've all had those moments. You know, when a really great idea just kind of clicks, you're like, wow, this could really make a difference.
Absolutely, that spark of possibility.
Exactly. But then here's the thing. Why do some of those seemingly brilliant ideas, those aha moments, actually explode into something huge, something that totally changes the game?
Right, they catch fire.
Yeah. While others that felt just as promising at the start just kind of stumble, they fade away, and we're left wondering what happened. That ambition, that drive to take something that works on a small scale and create a massive impact, that's what we're diving into today.
That journey of scaling an idea, it's filled with so much potential, but also so many pitfalls. That's exactly what we're focusing on.
And for this deep dive, our guide is John A. List and his really compelling book, The Voltage Effect. Now, List isn't your typical academic.
Oh, not at all.
He's a field experiment economist. He spent years not just theorizing, but actually getting his hands dirty, working in the real world.
Yeah, his background is amazing. I mean, he was chief economist at Uber and Lyft, for example.
Right, so he's seen firsthand what makes some ideas soar and others just completely sputter out.
That real-world experience is invaluable. I mean, his insights are grounded in observing how people actually behave, not just in some theoretical model. It's like he's treated the world as one giant, fascinating laboratory.
Okay, so the core question List tackles in The Voltage Effect is this. What's the secret sauce? What separates the ideas that successfully scale, that overcome all those obstacles, from the ones that just can't seem to break through and achieve that widespread impact?
And that's where this central metaphor of the book comes in. The voltage effect. It's such a great way to think about it. Imagine an idea having this certain level of energy, a potential to create change. Now, as you try to scale that idea, that voltage can either get amplified.
Leading to massive success.
Exactly. Or it can drop significantly, and that's when you see failure to scale.
Now, for you listening, and I know you're all about getting to the heart of these complex topics quickly and thoroughly.
And maybe having a few aha moments along the way.
Of course, consider this our fast track. We're going to unpack the essential elements, the make-or-break factors that determine whether an idea has the power to go big or if it's destined for that dreaded voltage drop.
You know, List has this great way of breaking down the scaling process. He focuses on its inherent fragility and identifies what he calls the 5 vital signs.
5 vital signs, okay.
Yeah, think of them as 5 critical hurdles that can cause an idea's voltage to plummet. We're going to focus on the first 2 of those vital signs today.
Okay, so let's jump right in. Why can scaling be so fragile? What's the first vital sign we need to watch out for?
Well, first one is false positives.
False positives. Okay, so in this context, what exactly does that mean?
So a false positive is basically when you have evidence that suggests an idea is working, but in reality, it isn't. It's like a misleading signal. And it can be really dangerous because it leads to people investing tons of resources, time, money, energy, into something that's ultimately not going to deliver at a larger scale.
And List kicks off this whole discussion with a really powerful example, and it's one that I think will resonate with a lot of people. The DARE program.
Oh yeah, DARE, Drug Abuse Resistance Education.
Just say no. We all remember that campaign. And DARE was a massive part of that national effort. What went wrong there?
So DARE was based on this idea called social inoculation.
Mm-hmm.
The basic concept was that if you expose young people to a little bit of information about drugs, it would help them develop a resistance to peer pressure and prevent them from using drugs. And there were some initial evaluations in places like Honolulu and Los Angeles that actually showed some promising results.
So it seemed like it was working, right? And that's why it gained so much support and funding across the country.
Exactly. Those early positive signs led to a huge investment in DARE. But here's where the false positive comes in. Decades of research, lots of independent studies, showed that DARE actually wasn't effective in preventing drug use.
Wow.
Some studies even suggested that it might have actually increased curiosity about drugs and even made kids more likely to experiment.
So the initial positive assessments, they were essentially a false alarm.
Yeah, the program just didn't have the voltage to really create lasting change on a large scale. And this is a huge takeaway, right? Those early wins, those initial positive results can be misleading, especially when scaling involves a ton of resources. Rigorous testing, going beyond that initial excitement, is so important.
It's a tough lesson. All that time and money poured into DARE, and it didn't really move the needle on drug abuse. List also brings up an example from the business world with Chrysler. What happened there?
So in the mid-2000s, Chrysler was facing some financial challenges. They were looking for ways to improve their bottom line, and they implemented this health and wellness initiative at one of their manufacturing plants.
Okay.
And they were using principles of behavioral economics, trying to encourage healthier habits. And initially, the results were promising. They saw improvements in employee health, lower healthcare costs, and less absenteeism.
Sounds great. A win-win. So how did that turn into a false positive?
Well, here's the catch. They tried to replicate that same program with different employees in the same plant.
Okay.
And then they tried it at 2 other Chrysler plants. They couldn't replicate those positive outcomes. It seemed like that initial success at that one specific plant was a statistical anomaly, a fluke, essentially, a false positive that didn't hold up under broader testing. This highlights the danger of making sweeping generalizations from limited data.
Right. Just because something works in one very specific context doesn't mean it's going to translate broadly.
Exactly. And this reinforces the need for thorough testing, repeated testing across different settings.
So initial success in a specific situation, it doesn't guarantee consistent results or success at a larger scale. Okay, so we've got the external factors, but List also talks about how our own thinking, our own biases can contribute to these false positives.
Oh, absolutely. Our brains are wired in ways that can sometimes lead us astray.
So what kind of biases are we talking about?
Well, there are a few key cognitive biases that List highlights. The first one is confirmation bias.
Confirmation bias, right. That's our tendency to favor information that confirms what we already believe.
Exactly. We look for evidence that supports our existing beliefs, and we tend to overlook or downplay anything that contradicts those beliefs.
And this list uses a classic experiment to illustrate this, right? Peter Watson's rule discovery test.
Yes, it's a great example. So in this test, participants are given a sequence of 3 numbers, like 2, 4, 6.
Okay.
And their job is to figure out the rule that governs that sequence. They can propose other 3-number sequences, and the experimenter tells them whether their sequence follows the rule or not.
So they're trying to crack the code, essentially.
Exactly. And the actual rule is really simple. Any 3 ascending numbers.
Oh, okay.
But what happens is that most participants, they latch on to a specific hypothesis, like even numbers increasing by 2, and they only test sequences that confirm that hypothesis.
So instead of trying to prove themselves wrong, they're just looking for evidence that supports their initial guess.
Right. They're stuck in this confirmation loop. They should be testing sequences that might disprove their theory.
That's fascinating. Okay, so confirmation bias, we're all susceptible to that. What about the bandwagon effect? How does that play into false positives?
The bandwagon effect, or herding,
Yeah.
is our tendency to go along with what everyone else is doing or believing.
Right, the everyone else is doing it mentality.
Exactly. We're social creatures, and the opinions and actions of others really influence our own judgment.
And this connects to Solomon Asch's famous line experiment, right?
Yes. So in Asch's experiment, you have a group of people, and they're asked to match the length of a line to one of 3 other lines. It's a really simple visual task.
Okay.
But here's the twist. Some of the people in the group are actually in on the experiment. They're Confederates, and they deliberately give the wrong answer.
Oh, interesting. So are people swayed by the group's incorrect answer?
Yes. A significant number of participants conformed and gave the incorrect answer, even though it was clearly wrong. They went along with the crowd, even when their own perception told them otherwise.
Wow, that's powerful. But how does this relate to false positives when we're talking about scaling ideas?
Think about it. When you have influential figures or organizations endorsing an idea, it creates this sense of legitimacy, whether or not the idea actually has merit.
Right. If so-and-so is doing it, it must be a good idea.
Exactly. And this is what we saw with DARE. Nancy Reagan was a strong advocate for the program.
Very influential.
Right. And that endorsement, along with the widespread adoption, created this bandwagon effect. People assumed it must be effective because everyone was on board.
Even if there wasn't solid evidence to back it up.
Exactly. The popularity masked the lack of real impact.
Okay, so we've talked about confirmation bias and the bandwagon effect. List also discusses something called the winner's curse. That sounds pretty ominous. What is that exactly?
It's a really interesting concept. The winner's curse usually happens in situations where people are bidding on something with an uncertain value.
Like an auction.
Yeah, exactly. The person who wins, the one who submits the highest bid, often ends up paying more than the thing is actually worth.
Because they overestimated its value.
Exactly. List uses this great example of a jar of coins in a classroom to illustrate this. He'd have students bid on a jar filled with coins.
Okay.
But they didn't know the exact amount. The student with the highest bid won the jar, but often they ended up paying more than the coins were actually worth.
So they were the most optimistic, but their optimism kind of backfired.
Exactly. And how does this apply to the failure of scaling? Well, when we get really excited about an idea and we see others investing in it, we can get overly optimistic about its potential.
We overestimate its value.
Right. And we're willing to put in more resources than it might actually deserve. This also ties into the sunk cost fallacy.
The sunk cost fallacy. That's our tendency to stick with something just because we've already invested a lot in it, right?
Exactly. We've already put so much time, money, or effort into it. We feel like we can't give up now.
Even if it's not really working.
Right. We've won the initial investment, but we might be overpaying in the long run by continuing to scale something that's not truly viable.
These biases are sneaky, aren't they? They're subtle, but they can really lead us down the wrong path. So what can we do to avoid falling into this false positive trap? Liz talks about replication as a key strategy.
Replication is essential. It basically means repeating a test or experiment under similar conditions to see if you get the same results.
So it's not enough for something to work once.
No, it needs to be consistent. And Liz tells this wonderful story about Ronald Fisher and Muriel Bristol's tea tasting experiment.
I love that story. It's such a
I know.
simple example, but it makes a really profound point.
It does. So Fisher, he was a brilliant statistician, and he was a bit skeptical of his colleague, Muriel Bristol.
What was she claiming?
She claimed that she could tell if milk was added to tea before or after the tea was poured.
Oh, wow.
Right. So to test her claim, they designed an experiment where she had to taste 8 cups of tea, 4 prepared each way. She didn't know the order, of course.
Okay.
And guess what? She correctly identified all 8 cups.
Really? She got them all right.
Yep. And this seemingly trivial experiment actually became a really important moment in the history of scientific research.
How so?
It highlighted the need for rigorous experimental design. You need to repeat tests, have multiple trials to make sure a finding is reliable. Fisher himself, even though he was initially skeptical, recognized that the more you repeat the experiment and get consistent results, the less likely it is that that initial success was just due to chance.
So you're not just relying on one-off successes.
Yeah.
You need to see that consistency.
Exactly. And List emphasizes that for replication to be truly meaningful, it needs to be independent.
Independent. Okay. What does that mean in this context?
It means that the testing should be done by people who aren't connected to the original idea or the people who developed it.
So you're removing that potential for bias.
Exactly. You want to minimize the influence of confirmation bias or any other biases that might unconsciously lead people to see what they want to see.
It's kind of like seeking a second opinion from a doctor.
That's a great analogy, and List actually uses that very example.
Yeah.
Getting a second opinion is a common and, honestly, a very smart practice.
Of course. You want to make sure you're getting the most accurate diagnosis.
Exactly. And List cites a pretty sobering statistic. A study estimated that medical errors are actually the 3rd leading cause of death in the U.S.
Wow, the 3rd leading cause. That's a lot higher than I would have guessed.
It is, and it underscores just how crucial it is to double-check initial findings, whether we're talking about healthcare or the scaling of an idea.
Okay, so replication is key, and it needs to be independent. List also talks about the differences between replication in scientific research and public policy versus the business world.
Yeah, there was a really interesting contrast there.
How so?
In the business world, particularly in tech, there's this thing called A/B testing.
A/B testing, right, I've heard of that.
It's a way to test different versions of a product or feature with real users. List gives the example of Lyft. They frequently A/B test new features in their app, rolling them out to a limited number of users in specific areas before they launch them nationwide.
It's like a trial run.
Exactly. This lets them quickly see what works and what doesn't with different groups of users.
Yeah.
But replicating large-scale scientific studies or public policy initiatives, that's way more complicated.
Right, you can't really A/B test a new education program across the country in the same way you can test different versions of a button on an app.
Exactly. Scientific research and public policy just operate at a different scale. There are logistical challenges, ethical considerations, and often political hurdles that make replication much harder.
And List also briefly touches on the replication crisis in psychology and something called the file drawer problem. Can you explain what those are and what they mean for us?
Sure. So the replication crisis refers to this trend in psychology where many research findings that were considered to be really solid couldn't be replicated when other researchers tried to repeat the studies.
So the original findings might have been flawed.
Right. And this raises serious questions about the reliability of some of the things we thought we knew in psychology.
Mm-hmm.
And the file drawer problem is related to this. It's this idea that studies that don't find a significant result, studies that don't find what they're looking for, often don't get published.
So they end up hidden away in a file drawer somewhere.
Exactly. And this creates a bias in the published research. It makes it seem like certain interventions are more effective than they actually are.
Because we're only seeing the positive results. The negative results are hidden.
Exactly.
That's really interesting and a bit concerning, honestly. It makes you realize how important it is to critically evaluate research and to look for signs of independent replication.
Absolutely. Don't just accept things at face value. Look for that supporting evidence.
Okay, so we've been talking about unintentional false positives, those statistical flukes and cognitive biases that can lead us astray. But List also digs into something even more troubling: deliberate deception. He calls this the duper effect.
Yeah, the duper effect. When people intentionally fabricate or manipulate research findings, this goes beyond honest mistakes. It's outright fraud.
And the example he uses here, which I think a lot of people will remember, is the case of Brian Wansink at Cornell University. Can you remind us what happened there?
Brian Wansink was a very prominent food psychologist. He was known for his research on how environmental cues influence what and how much people eat.
I remember some of his work. It was really interesting.
Yeah, he had a lot of attention. But then serious questions started to emerge about his research practices.
Like what?
Well, investigations found evidence of data fabrication. There were flawed methodologies, and he consistently failed to ensure the accuracy and completeness of his data.
So he was essentially manipulating his research to get the results he wanted.
Yeah. And it was a huge scandal. A lot of his papers were retracted by journals.
Retracted?
Yeah, basically taken back because they were considered to be unreliable.
Wow, that's a big deal. And it makes you wonder, how common is this kind of intentional deception? List actually mentions a rather surprising statistic from a survey of academic economists.
Is a surprising statistic. The survey asked economists about their research practices, and almost 5% admitted to having fabricated data at some point.
5%, that's pretty high. I mean, it's not the majority, but it's still a significant number.
It is. And it suggests that deliberate deception, while hopefully not widespread, might be more common than we'd like to think.
So what might drive someone to do that? What are the incentives within the academic system that could unfortunately lead to this kind of behavior?
Well, academics are under a lot of pressure to publish their research. It's often called publish or perish.
Publish or perish.
Yeah. Their careers depend on getting published, on getting grants, on building a strong reputation.
And positive findings, groundbreaking findings, those are the ones that get the most attention, right?
Exactly. So there's this pressure to produce those kinds of results. And unfortunately, that can lead some people to take shortcuts or even fabricate data.
It's a shame because the system that's supposed to be about the pursuit of knowledge can sometimes inadvertently create these perverse incentives.
It's definitely a complex issue.
Okay, so we've got this academic pressure, this publish or perish mentality. List then shifts gears to the business world, and he uses the high-profile case of Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos as an example of deception on a massive scale.
The Theranos case, it really captured the public's imagination. It's like something out of a movie.
It is. So for those who might not remember all the details, can you give us a quick recap?
So Elizabeth Holmes founded Theranos, this biotech startup,
Okay.
and they claimed to have developed this revolutionary blood testing technology that could do hundreds of tests with just a tiny drop of blood.
And this idea had huge appeal, right?
Huge. It was a game changer. Investors poured money into Theranos, and the company's valuation soared to billions of dollars.
It seemed too good to be true.
And it was. The technology didn't actually work as claimed.
Oh, wow.
Holmes had knowingly misled investors and the public.
But why? What was her motivation?
Well, she owned a significant amount of stock in Theranos, so her personal wealth was directly tied to the company's success.
So she had a huge financial incentive to keep the deception going.
Exactly. The potential for massive personal gain appears to have driven her actions.
This is where incentives, both in academia and in business, become so important. List talks about the need to create systems that encourage honesty and transparency, right?
Absolutely. He specifically talks about the importance of employee incentives to speak up when they see problems.
So whistleblowers, essentially.
Right. In Theranos, employees who raised concerns about the technology were often ignored or even threatened.
They were silenced.
Yeah. If there had been stronger protections for whistleblowers or even rewards for speaking up, maybe the truth would have come out sooner.
And potentially prevented a lot of damage.
Exactly.
List also mentions the incentive structure at Uber, where the person who proposes an idea is often the one responsible for testing it.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. What are the downsides of that approach? It seems like it could foster a sense of ownership and responsibility.
It could, but it also creates a potential conflict of interest. The person who came up with the idea might be more likely to interpret the results in a way that favors their idea, even if the data doesn't fully support it.
Right. Even if it's unintentional, they're going to have a bias towards seeing their idea succeed.
Exactly. So again, independent replication becomes really important. You want someone who doesn't have a personal stake in the idea to do the testing.
Okay, so to truly safeguard against deception, whether it's intentional or unintentional, having that independent validation is crucial.
I agree. Checks and balances are essential. And List talks about incentives in other areas too, right? Like acquisitions and profit sharing with employees.
Yes. When a company is acquired, for example, it's worth looking at whether the previous owner is staying on or leaving right away.
Okay, interesting.
If they're eager to exit, it might be a red flag. It might suggest that there are underlying problems they don't want to deal with.
That makes sense. And what about profit sharing with employees?
Well, that can help align everyone's incentives.
How so?
If employees have a stake in the company's overall success, they're going to be more motivated to contribute to its long-term growth and sustainability.
Right, their success becomes tied to the company's success.
Exactly.
And List also brings up this concept of bias disruptors. What are those and how can they help?
A bias disruptor is basically someone whose job is to challenge assumptions and look for weaknesses. It's like a devil's advocate.
So they're actively trying to poke holes in ideas and find potential flaws.
Exactly. And having that designated role in an organization can be really valuable. It helps mitigate the influence of those cognitive biases we talked about and can prevent companies from going all in on a flawed idea.
Okay, so to sum up this first vital sign, avoiding false positives, it's about rigorous testing, being aware of our biases, and creating systems that encourage honesty and critical thinking.
Exactly. It's about building a culture of skepticism in a healthy way.
Right. You have to be willing to question things, to challenge assumptions.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's move on to the second vital sign that List discusses, ignoring audience heterogeneity. What does that concept mean in the context of scaling an idea?
Essentially, it means failing to recognize that what works for one group of people might not work or could even backfire for another group.
Right, we're not all the same. What resonates with one person might not resonate with another.
Exactly. We have different needs, different preferences, different backgrounds, different circumstances. All of these things influence how we perceive and respond to the world around us.
And this applies to everything from products and services to public policy and social interventions.
Absolutely. A one-size-fits-all approach rarely works when you're trying to scale an idea.
And you actually used a great example earlier mentioning my potentially varied technical expertise. List uses a really compelling example from the business world, Logan Green and the founding of Lyft.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. So both Logan Green, the founder of Lyft, and Travis Kalanick, the founder of Uber, had this vision of transforming transportation with ride-sharing.
They were both disrupting the taxi industry.
Right. But their approaches were quite different. Lyft focuses on Green's idea for a paid membership program at Lyft.
A paid membership for ride sharing.
Yeah. Green was a big fan of Costco's membership model.
Okay, I can see the appeal there.
And he thought a similar model could work for Lyft. Create customer loyalty, generate recurring revenue, and give them an edge over Uber.
So you pay a monthly fee, and in return, you get discounts or perks. It seems like a viable idea on the surface.
It does. But I remember you expressing some skepticism about this concept when we first discussed it.
I did. I wasn't sure that ride sharing was a good fit for a subscription model.
Yeah.
How is it different from Costco or Netflix?
That's a great question, and it gets to the heart of why this is such a tricky issue.
Okay, so break it down for me.
Well, first of all, with Costco, you have to have membership to shop there.
Right, it's exclusive.
Exactly. And the things you buy at Costco, you can't easily find them elsewhere for the same price.
It's a unique value proposition.
Right. But with ride sharing, switching between Uber and Lyft is super easy.
Right. It's just a tap on your phone.
Exactly. And they're essentially offering the same service, getting you from point A to point B.
So the barrier to switching is really low.
Very low. So even if Lyft offers discounts to its members, it's not the same as the kind of exclusivity and value proposition that Costco offers.
I see. And List brings in some economic theory here to explain this, right? He talks about two-part tariffs, and the Disneyland dilemma.
He does. These concepts help us understand the challenges of pricing when you have a diverse customer base.
Okay, so explain it to me like I'm, well, someone who doesn't have a PhD in economics.
Okay, so two-part tariffs is this idea of having an upfront fee, like a membership, and then a per-unit price for each thing you consume.
Okay, I get that.
And the Disneyland dilemma looks at why Disneyland switched from charging for each ride individually to having one entrance fee that covers all the rides.
Oh, right, I remember that.
The key takeaway is that when you have different types of consumers, you need a pricing strategy that works for everyone, or at least for the majority. Charging per ride at Disneyland on top of the entrance fee discouraged people from going on a lot of rides.
Even though they'd already paid to get in.
Right, and Disneyland realized that having one price that covered everything encouraged people to use the park more and ultimately made them happier.
So how does this relate back to Lyft's membership idea?
Well, they weren't planning to charge per ride on top of the membership, but the question was, who would actually benefit from this model? Liz talks about the difference between benefiters and non-benefiters.
Benefiters and non-benefiters. Okay, what's the distinction?
Benefiters are the people who use a service more because of a membership. They're taking advantage of those discounts or perks, and they're riding more often than they would have without the membership.
They're getting their money's worth.
Exactly. Non-benefiters, on the other hand, they're mostly just paying less for the rides they were already taking. They're not really changing their behavior.
So the key for Lyft, or any company with a membership model, is to attract more of those benefiters, right?
Absolutely. Otherwise, they're just giving away discounts to people who are going to use the service anyway.
And that's not a sustainable business model.
No, it's not.
So what did Lyft do? Lyft mentions an experiment they ran with different pricing structures.
Yeah, it was a massive experiment.
Yeah.
They offered 6 different monthly membership pricing structures to over 1 million of their riders.
Wow, 1 million riders.
Yeah, and they varied the monthly fee and the discount percentage. This was a way to see how different groups of riders would respond to different incentives.
And what did they find?
Well, the results were pretty clear. None of the initial pricing structures were actually scalable.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the ratio of non-benefiters to benefiters was too high. For every person who actually increased their Lyft usage because of the membership, there were 3 people who were just paying less for their existing rides.
So the discounts weren't really driving new behavior.
Right. They were just subsidizing existing riders.
That makes sense. So what did Lyft do? Did they just scrap the whole membership idea?
No, they didn't give up. They dug into the data from that experiment, and they were able to come up with a better pricing structure.
What did that look like?
It was $19.99 per month for a 7.5% discount on all rides. They figured this would attract fewer members overall, but it would be more profitable because the ratio of benefiters to non-benefiters would be better.
Okay, so they were going for quality over quantity, essentially. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But a 7.5% discount? That doesn't sound that exciting.
Yeah, not really a game changer.
And that's where Lyft Pink came in. They realized they needed to offer more than just a discount. They needed to create a whole package of benefits that would really appeal to those high-frequency riders, the benefiters.
Well, what did they add?